is meeting with Ukraine's top leaders in Kiev. It's a show of support for that country's embattled interim government. But in the eastern part of Ukraine, pro-Russian gunmen not letting up one bit, seizing more government buildings in a dozen cities and towns. I want to bring in Fred Pleitgen right now, live from Kiev. Fred, give us an update on the goal of these meetings amidst this chaos really still in the eastern part of the country.
Yeah, I think chaos is exactly the right word. One of the things that, of course, these two sides are going to be talking about, the top-level Ukrainian politicians as well as Joe Biden, is going to be that situation in the east of the country. And apparently what the acting president of Ukraine told the vice president was that he believes that the Russians have already breached that Geneva agreement that was reached between the U.S., the EU, Russia, as well as Ukraine last week. They say that because these pro-Russian separatist groups have taken additional buildings instead of vacating all the buildings that they took and disarming, they feel that the agreement's been reached, and the Ukrainians, for their part, are saying they will react accordingly. So certainly a very volatile situation that the vice president has landed into. He's walking a very fine line diplomatically, where on the one hand, the U.S., as you know, has threatened additional sanctions against Moscow if it doesn't de-escalate in the coming days. But of course, the U.S. always wants to keep those diplomatic channels with Moscow open. At the same time, the U.S. wants to prop up the government here in Kiev. Several things that we expect to hear out of a press conference that was supposed to start a couple of minutes ago. We're now hearing that they're actually running quite late, is that the U.S. wants to offer economic assistance, technical assistance, and help Ukraine, and this is probably the most important point, help Ukraine achieve energy security, because they are very dependent on Russian gas, and it's certainly something that the Russians have been using as a weapon in this standoff that they have with Ukraine, John.
Fred, I want to talk about the pro-Russian militants right now in the eastern part of Ukraine who've taken over these government buildings. They've shown to be very unresponsive to both the Ukrainian government and to the United States as well. Has Russia, has Moscow, has Vladimir Putin shown any inclination right now to get those pro-Russian militants to move?
Zero at this point. In fact, one of the things that we seem to see is that on the one hand, those pro-Russian militants are saying that they don't feel bound by that agreement that was reached. They say it was not signed on their behalf. In fact, they're calling for the government here in Kiev to resign before they will lay down their weapons. And the Russians, for their part, seem to have a completely different interpretation of that agreement than the West does, and that the U.S. does. The U.S. says they have to get out of those buildings immediately. The Russians say that if those pro-Russian protesters are supposed to vacate those buildings in the east of the country, they want the square that's behind me, the Maidan, where, of course, the revolution took place a couple of months ago. They want that square to be cleared as well. The Russians are also saying that Ukrainian groups that have taken up arms need to lay down those arms before the pro-Russian protesters are set to do that. So there is still a lot of disagreement between the U.S. and Russia. There was a phone call last night between Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and John Kerry, and quite frankly, that did not lead to very much. So the two sides still very far apart, and there really isn't any sign, especially in the east of this country, that there's any de-escalation. And the U.S. knows that any de-escalation has to come from Moscow and be initiated by Moscow, John.
Rather ominous words from our Fred Pleitgen in Kiev, who says there's been zero movement now towards any kind of diplomatic solution in the eastern part of that country. Fred, thanks so much.